class, but Friday will be the very last class. It's sad. Did you know that there's 160 people enrolled in this class? You are my friends. In the last class on Friday, I will finish lecturing on language acquisition, but I will reserve a certain period of time to answer questions you might have that would be useful for you in preparing for the final, okay? And I will also bring to class sort of a rundown, like I did before this last midterm, of the things I think you should study for the final. The final is on May 11th, Tuesday. It meets in this room. It starts at 1:30. So on Friday, bring questions if you have them. I'll set aside some time to answer questions you might have. All right? Well, we were looking last week at something concerning the puzzle of how it is that we have managed to acquire the rules in phonology and in syntax, the phonotactic constraints, the phrase structure rules, and so on. How has it come about that we have learned this stuff? How is it that in your minds sits something that allows you to command this information when using English? And I tried last week really just to give you a feel for the problem, for how abstract and difficult it is to acquire rules of the complexity that I've tried to show you lie behind your ability to use a language. How difficult it is to acquire rules of that sort given just hearing sentences, as it were, from that grammar. Okay? It's a real puzzle. It's the puzzle in linguistics. How is it that we are able to acquire these rules rather quickly? Children can do this in 5 or 6 years. A lot of phonology is learned in the first 3 years. In fact, I'll tell you, a lot of phonology is learned in the first few weeks. Miraculously fast. Mm-hmm. How is that possible? We don't know. What we do know is a little bit about what kids actually do as they develop. So another, the little we know about how this process unfolds, we know by, well, as it were, treating children as if they were speakers of a different language. We look at children at various stages in their development. We try, through various techniques, to determine what their grammar of, well, English, if that's what they're acquiring, or Chinese, if that's what they're acquiring, what their grammar looks like. What are their rules that tell you how sentences should be arranged? What are their phonotactic constraints? What do they think the grammar looks like that they're acquiring? And we can get kind of a map of how their mind changes, their tiny little feeble mind changes from month to month. Mm-hmm. And in these last 2 days, I thought I would show you a little bit about what we know looking at children this way, looking at how the grammar that they're acquiring develops in their head. I'll start today by telling you a bit about syntax. So let's think about the two things that need to be acquired in syntax. One are the phrase structure rules. Yeah. They need to know, for instance, if they were learning English, that verb phrases start with verbs and then have noun phrases or prepositional phrases or what have you following those verbs. If they were acquiring Japanese, as it happens, Japanese looks just like English, except the verb goes on the other side. The verb follows the noun phrase or prepositional phrase. Oh, is this the other side for you? At the end. Mm-hmm. So if they were learning Japanese, our little buggers, they'd have to learn a different phrase structure rule for verb phrases. So how does that happen? What do kids do along the way? What kinds of mistakes do they make? The miracle is that we have never found a child so young that they don't know the phrase structure rules of the language they're acquiring. We simply never see a child mistakenly putting the verb, say, after the object in English rather than before it. Or if you were to look at Japanese children, we never see a Japanese child mistakenly putting the verb in the English position before its object. Japanese kids always know, oh yeah, the verbs come last, after the noun phrase or prepositional phrase. So far as we know, kids seem to acquire this so fast that we've not found a young enough child yet that hasn't already learned it. Yeah. We know nothing then about how kids acquire phrase structure rules. We never see them doing it. They do it so fast. So what does that leave? That leaves looking at how children acquire rules like the cleft rule, which change sentences around a little bit. This children do learn more slowly, and slow enough for us to actually see how they acquire those rules. Okay? The first person to discover this was a woman named Ursula Bellugi, who wrote in the late 60s on this subject. In fact, she wrote a dissertation at Harvard on this. And I thought I would show you what she discovered and what's now been replicated many times. Ursula Bellugi, 67, Harvard dissertation. She looked at two rules. She asked, how do kids acquire these two rules? The two rules are rules I haven't yet taught you. So let me teach them to you very quickly. One rule is involved in forming a certain kind of question. That rule forms from a normal sentence, a sentence of the sort that our phrase structure rules can make, like Jerry has questioned an elf. A question. Has Jerry questioned an elf? What the rule does is it takes the first verb and it moves it to the front of the sentence. Okay? So if I were to have taught you more syntax, I would have taught you that there's a rule of this sort. Jerry must eat natto becomes the question under this rule, must Jerry eat natto? Jerry is running becomes the question, is Jerry running? Jerry did kiss an elf becomes, did Jerry kiss an elf? Okay? Clear? One kind of funny thing about this rule is that it only moves auxiliary verbs. Auxiliary verbs, you'll remember, are verbs like have and be, must, should, can, and do. No other verb can be used to form this kind of question in English. So, for instance, there is no question form that comes from this sentence. Jerry kissed an elf. Kiss Jerry an elf is not a possible English question. Okay? So the rule looks like this. Move auxiliary verb to the front of the sentence. You got that in your heads. You use that rule every time you try and ask these sorts of questions. All right? As you know, in this class I try and teach you more than just the arcane, pointless material of linguistics. I try to teach you life skills as well. Today's life skill involves natto. Does anyone know what natto is? Ma'am.
It's like it's a Japanese dish that's like a fermented beans. It's really, really, really sticky.
Sticky?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Did you hear that? Japanese dish, fermented beans, really, really sticky. There's a hand back there.
Also really smelly.
Also very smelly. Do you eat this? Do you like this? Where are you from? Yes. Where in Japan are you from? You're from Osaka. Figures. Natto is eaten, yes, it's a fermented bean concoction eaten in Japan, not everywhere in Japan, only some places. It is I wouldn't describe it as sticky. I would describe it as, well, slimy, I think is the word I would use. Slimy. And yes, it does smell. In fact, it smells very, very much like vomit. If there was one thing it smelled like, it would have to be vomit. This is eaten in the morning in Japan. Beware of breakfast when you are traveling in Japan. Natto. Okay, question rule. That's for the final. Natto, that's for your continued good health. The second rule that Ursula Bellugi looked at is a rule that's used to take a sentence and deny it, negate it. What this rule does is it actually inserts a word into a sentence, and that word is not. Okay? So from the sentence Jerry has left can be formed this denial of Jerry has left, this negation, as they say, Jerry has not left. All right? From Sally can eat kasumarzu can be formed Sally cannot eat kasumarzu. From Sally is eating kasumarzu can be formed by this rule Sally is not eating kasumarzu. Okay. In all of these sentences, what the rule has done is introduce this word not. And notice it comes right after the auxiliary verb here. And it can come nowhere else. So something like Jerry not has left, that's ungrammatical. And Jerry has left not is only grammatical if you're, younger than 50 and using that style of not speech. Okay? Right. So this is the only place not goes. Right after the auxiliary verb. And in fact, it only goes after auxiliary verbs. So this sentence, Cory likes kasumarzu, has no negation. There's no way to negate it. There's no auxiliary verb, and that's what the rule requires. Put not immediately after the auxiliary verb. Cory likes not kasumarzu. Tain't good.
What's kasumarzu?
Kasumarzu, another life lesson. Ma'am, do you know kasumarzu?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Isn't kasumarzu the cheese that they wait until it's been infested with maggots, and then you eat it while there's maggots and things in it?
Yes, that's exactly right. This is cheese with maggots in it. The chief danger here is in Sardinia. If you're in Italy, stay off of that island, as this is something you might encounter. Maggots are in it, but they're not just any old maggot. No, they jump. They're jumping maggots. You bite and dodge. Okay, kasumarzu, natto. Please, ladies and gentlemen, be very careful of what you eat when you travel. A few things I've discovered along the way. Okay, so here are the two rules Ursula Bellugi looked at. And she asked, okay, so how is it that we have managed to acquire this? How do kids do this? And what she did is she looked at 3 children in the Cambridge area. I think one was in Somerville, one was in Boston, and the other in Cambridge. 3 kids. And she went to their home, I think every week, and she recorded their speech. She recorded discussions she had with these kids. She recorded discussions she heard between them and their parents. And she did this over a period of a couple of years and just watched how their sentences changed. And from the sentences they used, she made deductions about what their grammar must look like. And so, in particular, she looked at how their negative sentences were formed and how their questions were formed. And she watched to see whether they used these rules, the rules their parents and she used, or something else. Now, one thing she found, which is kind of surprising in a way, is that first, they did not know these rules at the beginning. They did something different. I'll show you that. Second, what they did, all 3 kids, was the same damn thing. Okay? Not the rules they were acquiring, something completely different, but all of them did the same damn thing. And they changed what they did at roughly the same times in their linguistic development. So they went through stages. They started with one kind of grammar, all of them the same thing, They switched to a different grammar, all of them roughly at the same time, and the same wrong grammar. And so it went until they ended up with these rules. Interestingly, they didn't all do this at the same ages. But they did do this all at roughly the same time in their linguistic development, at the same time in which their command of English was roughly the same. And there's a measure of linguistic development which is very simple and which I'll teach you now. It's called mean length of utterance. It's nothing more than just a measure of how long their sentences are. What a mean length of utterance is the average number of morphemes in their sentence. So what you do is you take, for each sentence, you count the number of morphemes, and you divide by the number of sentences. So you take all the morphemes they utter, divide that by sentences. So like for instance, if these were 3 sentences, the first, the unbelievable pigeon stinks, has 7 morphemes. Unbelievable has these 3. Stinks has these 2, that's 7. Many dogs have untied their shoelaces. Here's a compound shoelace. Here's a plural sa, so there's 3 here. Here's the verb tie with the prefix un, past tense, plural. So if you count up all those morphemes here, we get 11. And in Sally reworked her homework, here's a compound. We get, again, 7 like the first. We add these up. We get 25, I hope. Yeah, and we divide by 3. I have no idea what 7 is doing here. And this is the mean. Okay? Do you see what I did? So, on average, we can see how long people's sentences are. Speech directed from one adult to the next is on average about 12 MLUs. About 12 morphemes. Okay. What she found is that these kids had roughly the same kind of grammar when their sentences were roughly the same length, the same MLUs. All right? So let's look at what she discovered. The 3 kids are named Adam, Eve, and Sarah. These aren't their actual names. I'm thinking these might be inspired by some old book. Okay? And here's what she found at their youngest stage of development. So this is when their sentences are, somewhere like 2 words long. So the average count of morphemes is 1 point, somewhere between 7 and 9. Okay. Pretty short sentences. And you can see that Adam and Eve hit this stage at about their, a little over their 2nd year. Sarah is zooming ahead. She hits this stage much younger. These kids, by the way, were from completely different sorts of backgrounds. So I think one kid was the offspring of a lawyer and a homemaker, and or domestic, whatever the term is for someone who works at home, homemaker, I guess. And the other was an offspring of some sort of clergy person, priest or minister, I can't remember. And the other was the offspring of someone who worked in a factory. Okay. And here's what their grammar looked like. So as for questions, they just said whatever sentence they wanted to say, and they used rising intonation to indicate that it was a question. Okay, so they would say things like, we can do this as well as adults. They would say things like, feed me? Good girl? Change diaper? Okay, things like that. Yeah. Their sentences are tremendously short. There are no auxiliary verbs in them. And as for negative sentences, here's what they would do. They would say the sentence they were trying to say, and they would put something at the beginning that meant not, roughly. Often that word was no. Sometimes it was not. So here's some examples. So, no, the sun's shining. It was clear from the context that the child meant the sun isn't shining. No, go back. Clear from the context this meant don't go back. No, pinch me. Well, yeah, okay. So what are they doing? Their rule for negation is take the sentence, put the word that means not before it. Ursula Bellugi was very careful to listen to the speech that was used by the parents of these kids. They never said anything like this. So these kids came up with this rule on the basis of zero evidence. They're never hearing sentences like this, but this is how they think sentences should be negated. All of them. We've looked at millions of kids now. They all do this. Weird. We've, beaten them. We've tried everything. They insist on negating sentences this way at the youngest stage. Stage 2 is hit when the sentences are reaching past or close to 3 words. You can see that this is right around the 3rd year for Adam and Eve, and Sarah again is hitting this stage a little bit earlier, right before her 2nd year. Okay? What happens here? Very little. So, questions still don't appear in adult-like form. Instead, questions are just the sentence that they're asking with rising intonation. There are auxiliaries, but interestingly, they're always negative. So they're things like can't or don't, but never can or do or have or is. Never. And finally, the rule for negating sentences has changed. It's a little bit more like the adult rule, their parents' rule, but not quite the same. So here's what they do. They put the word that means not, no longer at the front of the sentence, but between the subject and the rest. So we have, that not honey, that isn't honey. I not bending them, I'm not bending them. I not gonna ruin it, I'm not gonna ruin it. I know taste earrings. One of the children was abused, obviously. You see? So it's sort of like, just like English, I mean adult English, but without the auxiliary verb. Bellugi suggested that at this stage, kids don't really have auxiliaries yet. They have these things, can't and don't, but they've made a mistake, these children have, about what those things are. She speculated that these kids think that this is just a fancy word for not. Just another way of negating a sentence. So maybe what the kids are thinking here is, okay, there's a lot of words that mean not. Not is one of them, don't is another, can't is another, and my rule is put that thing right after the subject. Okay? Odd, again, that all of them came up with this very same rule roughly at the same stage, and believe me, this happens over and over and over again for kids acquiring English. The 3rd stage happens in their 3rd year for Eve, close to the end of the 3rd year. What am I saying? Close to 4 morphemes per sentence, and you can see the ages here. Happened really quick for Sarah. There's 3 months between the 2nd and the 3rd stage. And in the 3rd stage, a lot happens. Basically, they're adults as far as these rules go. Suddenly, they have auxiliary verbs. So, Fraser have moved the chair. Fraser was the pet name for Ursula. You can imagine trying to say Ursula when you're 2. So Fraser was the name for Ursula. I think that's right, yeah. Can, will, all the auxiliary verbs come in. Questions suddenly are just like adults. Did you make a great big hold in here? Could I sue this one? Offspring of a lawyer. Don't forget. Could I get some other piece of paper? So on, yeah? Suddenly, just like adults. And negation, also very much like adults. He will not come. this doesn't work, he didn't say nothing. Okay, so the nothing's a little wrong. Give the kid a break. They have basically both at the same time the rule for negating sentences, put not after the auxiliary verb, the rule for forming questions, move the auxiliary verb to the front. They get those both like that at the same time and at the very same moment that they discover auxiliary verbs. Both these rules make reference to auxiliary verbs. You can't use the rule unless you know an auxiliary verb. So what it looks like is it took these kids, 3, 4 years to figure out what an auxiliary verb was. As soon as they figure out what an auxiliary verb is, they know the rules. It took them no time to learn these rules. It took them, in kids' lives, forever to learn an auxiliary verb. We have no idea why. Auxiliary verbs seem like an easy thing to learn. These rules, they don't seem so easy to me. But for kids, it's just the other way around. It's almost like these children were sitting around thinking, all right, I've got this rule, but how do I use it? Where is the auxiliary verb? And as soon as they had the auxiliary verb, now I know how to use the rule. That's what I wanted to show you about syntax. That's a paper you should never read. Okay. Can you sing some theme music, can you please? Oh, that's excellent. Okay, cut. Or fade. So the next thing I wanted to show you is, I guess I should do the breathing, huh? Always wanted to be that one. He was my hero. I mean, just the outfit alone. Yeah. I mean, as a love interest. But, as a role model, no. Okay, phonology. Let's hope you never find my partner. Yes, that would be. Okay, so now what is it that is involved in acquiring phonology? Okay, so what have we learned sits in your heads? Well, you know something about how syllables are formed. And you know that one of the components of forming syllables, in fact, the component that varies from language to language, is which things can be in onsets, which things can be in codas, the phonotactic constraints. Right? We saw Japanese as different than English on this respect, so you have to learn things like that. How many consonants can be in an onset? And when there's 3 of them, what are they? How many things can be in codas? So on and so forth. So that's something you learned. You also have to learn something about, what sounds are actually used in the language that you're acquiring. We saw, too, that that's something that changes from language to language. And you have to learn, once you've learned which sounds are used, which of those are allophones and which of those are phonemes. Remember that? That's hard, isn't it? You have to learn that as well. Right? So you have to answer questions like those horrible things I ask you on homework assignments and in tests. Are these 2 sounds, pa and ba, different phonemes or allophones in the language I'm acquiring? Are these 2 things, pa and pa, allophones or different phonemes in the language I'm acquiring? You have to figure that out somehow. You did that when you learned English. And then you have to figure out not only which are phonemes and allophones, but what the rules that make the allophones look like. This is some of the stuff you've learned. So let's look at what we know about how you learned it, how kids in general learn this stuff. So the first thing we have to do in figuring this out is, what does it mean for you to know that two sounds are different phonemes? What does that actually, physically, mentally mean? And let me ask that question, or try to answer it anyway, by considering just this contrast. What does it mean to know that pa is different from ba, phonemically? That these are two different sounds that are used as the building blocks to make morphemes, different phonemes in English. Pa and ba, as you know, are really just the same sound. They're a stop made at the lips. The only difference in them is that this one's voiceless and this one's voiced. Right? So actually, what we're trying to ask now is, how is it that you've learned that being voiced or voiceless matters? What? Oh, it's just a blank page? But you're looking at the blank page instead of me. I mean, am I really worse than a blank page? Yeah, that's the right answer. Yeah, not the answer I often get, but nonetheless. Yeah, so what does it mean for voicing to be relevant in distinguishing phonemes? Well, we have actually a very precise idea about this. And it comes from this fellow, Arthur Abramson, and his colleague, Lisker. Lay? Is that how you say his name? Lay Lisker. These two guys worked at Haskin Laboratories, which is where the phone company had their labs for a long time. Phone company is interested in figuring out, what do you have to hear in order to be able to distinguish one sound from another? How much information needs to be piped through the phone lines for you to be able to hear these sounds as being different? And so they hired lots of people to figure this out, including these two. And here's what they discovered. They discovered this, by the way, by doing this. They took a bunch of freshmen and sophomores in college. They put them in a soundproof room. They strapped them down. Important to strap them down. Then they synthesized speech. And they controlled very carefully all of the components that went into the sounds that were piped through their ears. And one of the things they manipulated, so you know, they would pipe into this room a sound that sounded like ba, 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 and they would ask, is that pa or ba? Okay. And the students would go, let me out of this damn thing! It's a pa! Okay? And then they would change the sound a little bit so that it sounded like this. Ba, ba, ba. And they would ask the same thing. Do you hear pa or is it ba? Okay? And what they would change is exactly this. They would change the time that elapses from releasing the closure at the lips to the start of the vowel that follows. That's all they would change. Everything else would be exactly the same. And what they found is that people would hear this sound as ba, ba, if the time that elapses from releasing the closure of the consonant, pa or ba, and starting the vowel is 25 milliseconds or less. But if the time that elapses from releasing the closure of this consonant and starting the vowel is 30, 35 milliseconds or greater, it sounds like pa. Okay. All right? So you being able to hear that pa is different than ba, that's exactly what it means to be two different phonemes. That you are able to hear that difference consists in knowing how long the voice onset time, as it's called, is. how long after you release the stop and start the vowel that follows, how long has that period gone? You have a little clock in your mind. That little clock says, oh, greater than 30 milliseconds, it's a pa. Less than 30 milliseconds, it's a ba. If you do this test on adults for which pa and ba are not different phonemes, they don't hear any difference. 20 millisecond onset time, 40 millisecond onset time, all the same to them. They don't hear the difference. Learning that pa is a different phoneme than ba is learning something about what to hear. That's what it means to be a different phoneme. You with me? So, question. When do kids learn this? Answer. Never. They never learn it. What? They never learn it because they always know it. At 1 month old, if you do to 1 month old kids acquiring English the same exact experiment that you do with adults, they will hear the difference between pa, greater than 30 milliseconds, or ba, less than 30 milliseconds. Ma'am? How do you test it on a 1 month old? Well, you put them in a room. You don't need to strap the 1 month olds down. Fortunately, they're very, very slow. Okay? And you do exactly the same thing. You pipe in synthesized speech that is either pa or ba, depending on the voice onset time, and you ask them, well, what do you hear? Is it pa or is it ba? And here's what they do. Okay. All right, so that didn't work. So they had to find some clever way of getting a child to answer this question. So here's what they did. I didn't do this, okay? Someone else did this. I wish I had done this. What they did is they took a pacifier and they wired it up. They stick the pacifier in the child's mouth violently. Okay? And when you do that, what a child will do is this. Okay? And then you wait for them to calm down. Sometimes you have to wait a long time. And when they calm down, it turns out that they don't stop sucking. If there's something in a child's mouth, it will suck. But it does turn out that every child has what's known as a base sucking rate. And they will calm down to their base sucking rate. Okay? It's just the worst thing ever to talk about this. Okay? Then, when you make a child excited, which is really easy to do, their sucking rate jumps. Okay? A way to make a child excited is to introduce something new into their field of vision, into their room. All right? So that's what they did. They pacifier in mouth, ba, 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 ba. Minutes go by, calm down to base sucking rate. And then you change the voice onset time. Millisecond by millisecond. 5 millisecond difference, no change. 10 millisecond difference, no change. You get to 30 milliseconds, they suck like mad. Peter Imus is the fellow who did this in '71, and here are the results. So here's what we do. Stick pacifier in mouth. Sucking rate, 60 per whatever, minute, I guess. I'd be right? Yeah, probably. 60 per minute. Wait for them to calm down. Yeah. Then change the voice onset time. If you change it so that you go past the 30 millisecond threshold, excitement. They jump back up, sucking like mad, and start to calm down. If you change the voice onset time so that it does not cross the 30 millisecond threshold, so it changes like from 10 to 20, say, or from 50 to 60, say. A small jump, but not really anything. And if you don't change it at all, they just get calmer and calmer until finally sleep and no sucking. Okay. Sir?
I talked to Meg about this on Friday, but amplitude, how hard they suck, is there any studies done on that and what the findings are different?
Oh, how hard they suck rather than how fast.
Right, well, both, if they take into consideration both, or if
Yeah.
there's separate for...
Yeah. Gosh, I think this may be the only study I know that uses the sucking rate thing, that uses this technique. And as far as they didn't use how hard, they just used how fast. Do you know if hardness matters?
I'm hoping I wasn't wrong, but I think I've seen some.
You've seen studies where sucking harder also happens. Okay, so some kids are smart enough to know, that a harder draw is just as effective as a faster suck. Okay. So it's a very striking thing. These are, this happens as early as 1 month. It's like they know this stuff right off. Yeah. Actually, what's kind of surprising is that there's evidence that even kids who are learning a language where these sounds are not phonemes, so their parents cannot hear this distinction, the kids can. So let me show you that study. This was done first, I think, by this woman, Janet Werker? I don't know her. And her studies happened in the 80s. And here's what she did. She tried to figure out, and so like what we knew at this point was that kids were able to make these distinctions that adults were able to as well in the same language. Yeah. They're able to make distinctions that some adults in another language, cannot make. So what's happening there? So what she did is she looked at two sorts of phonemic contrasts, and she tested that are not found in English. And she tested English kids to see if they could hear what the adults cannot hear. The two contrasts she looked at were Hindi stops. In Hindi, there are two sounds. One is just like our ta, ta. And the other one is a lot like our ta, but the tongue is rolled back. It's ta, ta, ta. I exaggerated it. Can you hear that difference? Ta, ta. Can you hear that difference? Those are two phonemes in Hindi. They're nothing like that in English. Okay. And the other two sounds she tested English kids as being able to hear is found in this Salish language, a language spoken on the Pacific Northwest coast, up in Canada around BC. This language has a sound that's just like our ka, ka. That's a velar stop made by taking the tongue and making a closure at the velum. But this language has another sound English doesn't have, which is a different phoneme, and it's ka. Ka, ka. Can you hear the difference? Ka, ka. The second sound is made by bringing the tongue farther down in the throat, lower than the velum, and making a stop there. Okay? It's sort of like you're about to gag, ka, 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 but you don't. Okay? So here's ka, ki, and here's ka, ki. Okay. And what she tested was Can speakers of the Salish language, called Thompson here, can they make this distinction? Yeah, every time. You give them ki, they hear it every time. You give English adults this distinction and ask them, can they distinguish these two sounds? No, not really. Less than chance. They're just guessing, and badly. Okay. Can kids do it? English acquiring kids? Yeah, pretty good. Not as good as the adults in Salish, but pretty good. Up around 90% of the time they get it right. Kids can hear things you can't hear. And the same thing's true for the Hindi difference between ta and ta. In fact, look at this graph here. These are kids that are acquiring English, being asked to distinguish ta and ka and ka when they're about 7 months old. They do it fabulously well. They're asked to do the same thing about when they're 9 months old. Yeah, they're not so good with the Salish contrast anymore. Hindi they can still hear. You wait a year, can't hear shit. They're as bad as you are at hearing this difference. How are phonemes acquired? We are born being able to hear every possible sound in the world's languages. And as we learn the language we're supposed to use, we lose that ability. We retain it only for those sounds that the language we're learning actually uses as phonemes. No learning here, just unlearning. More. Yeah?
If we're going to, we're all learning different languages now too.
Yeah.
If you were going to do that, can you train yourself to hear the difference?
Yeah, so can you, as an adult, bring yourself back to a childlike state? And I think the answer is the answer yes? Do we know? This is known. There are studies on this. I'm trying to remember one of them. I think the answer is sort of yes. I think you can train people to hear the difference, but I think the details involved in making this distinction differ from those who are learning this language as an adult from those who are learning this language as a child. So yes, but not exactly, I think is the right answer. More on Friday.